Hot women have never had more power than they do today. More attention, more money, more options. But here's the uncomfortable question no one wants to ask. If all this power is real, why does it disappear the moment beauty fades? This video isn't about shaming women. It's about exposing a system that profits from desire while quietly draining meaning, connection, and self-worth from both sides. If you've ever wondered why modern relationships feel empty, transactional, or confusing, stay with me. Attention and attraction are often confused, especially in a culture that measures worth through visibility. Attention is loud, immediate, and easy to manufacture. It comes from exposure, novelty, and availability. Attraction, on the other hand, is quiet and selective. It grows over time and requires depth, mystery, and emotional substance. The modern world teaches people, especially women, that if many eyes are on you, you must be desirable. But attention is not a measure of how deeply someone wants you. It is a measure of how easily you can be consumed. Attraction involves choice, investment, and restraint, while attention thrives on abundance and excess. When everyone can see you, comment on you, or access you, you become familiar rather than special, visible rather than valued. Attention feeds the ego but starves the soul. It creates a rush that feels like validation, yet it rarely translates into commitment or care. People who give attention have very little at stake. They can admire, desire, and disappear without consequence. Attraction is different because it involves risk. To be attracted to someone is to focus, to narrow options, and to move with intention. This is why attention often comes in floods, while attraction comes in silence. One makes you feel powerful in the moment. The other makes you feel secure over time. Attention asks nothing of the giver, but attraction demands consistency, respect, and emotional presence. In transactional environments, attention becomes abundant but meaningless. When admiration is purchased, curated, or algorithmically amplified, it loses its filtering mechanism. Anyone can participate, and therefore no one is chosen. Attraction requires standards and boundaries. It grows when access is limited and when a person is not immediately available for consumption. Attention, however, thrives on constant exposure. The more visible you are, the more attention you receive, but visibility also strips away intrigue. When there is nothing to earn, nothing feels valuable. Attraction depends on scarcity, not in the sense of manipulation, but in the sense of self-respect and discernment. The danger lies in mistaking attention for proof of desirability. Attention often comes from impulse, curiosity, or fantasy, not from genuine interest in who someone is beyond the surface. Attraction involves seeing a person in their complexity, their values, temperament, and emotional intelligence. Attention reacts to appearance. Attraction responds to presence. One can exist without responsibility, while the other invites accountability. This is why attention fluctuates with trends, youth, and novelty, while attraction is anchored in substance and compatibility. When someone builds their identity around attention, they become dependent on external reinforcement. Silence begins to feel like rejection, and invisibility feels like loss of worth. Attraction does not create this dependency because it is rooted in mutual recognition rather than public validation. It does not require an audience. It requires alignment. Attention is loud but fleeting. Attraction is subtle but enduring. One inflates the sense of self without strengthening it, while the other quietly shapes how someone is treated, chosen, and prioritized in real life. The illusion of power is one of the most seductive traps in modern culture. It presents itself as control, freedom, and dominance, but underneath it is often dependency dressed up as choice. When power is derived from external validation, money, attention, desire, or access, it feels intoxicating because it arrives quickly and visibly. But real power is quiet and self contained, while illusory power is loud and constantly in need of confirmation. The moment power depends on how others respond to you. It is no longer yours to command. It can be taken away, redirected, or replaced without warning, leaving the person who relied on it feeling suddenly exposed and disposable. This illusion thrives when people confuse leverage with stability. Being wanted does not mean being protected. Being desired does not mean being respected. Temporary leverage creates the feeling of being untouchable, but it is conditional by nature. The conditions may be beauty, youth, novelty, or availability, and as long as those conditions are met, the power appears real. But the moment the conditions change, and they always do, the leverage collapses. True power does not require constant performance. Illusory power demands maintenance, upkeep, and self erasure to remain appealing. It pressures people to stay desirable rather than grounded, reactive rather than intentional. The illusion becomes stronger when rewards arrive without effort toward growth. Easy money, easy admiration, and easy influence can create a distorted sense of self worth. When outcomes are detached from skill, discipline, or character, the individual begins to believe the reward is proof of superiority rather than circumstance. This is where the illusion deepens. People start making long-term identity decisions based on short-term advantages. They confuse momentum with direction and applause with alignment. Power that cannot survive silence is not power, it is stimulation. Another danger of illusory power is how it reshapes boundaries. When people believe they are powerful, they often tolerate disrespect because the rewards feel compensatory. They accept instability because it feels exciting. They trade autonomy for validation while telling themselves they are in control. But control that requires self-betrayal is not control at all. The illusion convinces individuals that they are choosing freely while quietly narrowing their options over time. What starts as empowerment slowly becomes entrapment, not through force, but through dependence on a system that rewards visibility over integrity. Real power is boring by comparison. It is built through competence, self-knowledge, and the ability to walk away. It does not need an audience to exist, nor does it panic when attention shifts elsewhere. Illusory power, however, collapses in solitude. It cannot survive aging, changing markets, or shifting desires. It fears irrelevance because irrelevance exposes the truth that the power was never owned, only borrowed. And borrowed power always comes with terms that are revealed too late, when the cost has already been paid in identity, security, and self-trust. Transactional desire is desire stripped of vulnerability and repackaged as convenience. It replaces curiosity with access and replaces emotional risk with certainty. In a transactional framework, intimacy is no longer something that unfolds, it is something that is delivered. This shift changes not only how people relate to each other, but how they understand desire itself. Desire becomes predictable, measurable, and controlled. There is no room for uncertainty, rejection, or growth because everything has already been agreed upon. What looks like clarity is actually the removal of depth. When desire is negotiated up front, it loses its transformative power and becomes a service rather than an experience. In transactional desire, the human being becomes secondary to the function they perform. Attention, affection, sexuality, and presence are no longer expressions of connection. They are outputs exchanged for compensation. This creates a psychological distance that protects both parties from discomfort, but also from meaning. The person paying does not have to be emotionally available, and the person being paid does not have to be emotionally invested. This arrangement feels safe because it eliminates ambiguity, but safety achieved through emotional detachment carries a quiet cost. Over time, desire stops being something that arises naturally and becomes something that must be activated by payment or performance. The danger of transactional desire is not immorality, but conditioning. When people repeatedly experience desire as something bought, they begin to internalize the belief that affection must be earned through utility rather than authenticity. Emotional presence becomes labor, and self expression becomes a strategy. The body, the personality, even vulnerability are optimized for consumption. This reshapes identity. Instead of asking, "Who am I when I am relaxed and honest?" the question becomes, "What version of me is most in demand?" Desire no longer reflects mutual resonance, it reflects market trends. Transactional desire also distorts power dynamics. On the surface, both sides appear to be consenting adults making rational choices. But beneath that surface, one side is purchasing control over time, attention, and emotional tone, while the other is adjusting themselves to remain desirable. This creates asymmetry even when both parties benefit materially. The person who pays retains the ability to leave without consequence, while the person who performs absorbs the emotional residue of repeated departures. Desire without attachment may feel liberating at first, but over time it trains the nervous system to disconnect intimacy from safety. As transactional desire becomes normalized, it bleeds into non transactional relationships. Expectations shift. People become less patient, less tolerant of emotional complexity, and less willing to invest without guaranteed returns. Genuine attraction begins to feel inefficient because it requires uncertainty and effort. Emotional negotiation replaces emotional discovery. The result is a culture that craves intimacy but avoids the very conditions that allow intimacy to grow. Desire becomes abundant but shallow, available but unsatisfying, endlessly exchanged, yet rarely felt deeply enough to leave a lasting imprint. The cost no one talks about is not financial, social, or even moral. It is psychological, and it accumulates quietly. It shows up long after the attention fades, the transactions stop, and the applause dies down. When a person repeatedly experiences themselves as an object of desire rather than a subject with inner depth, something subtle begins to erode. The mind learns to associate worth with reaction rather than reflection, and identity becomes dependent on external mirrors. Over time, the inner self grows quieter, not because it has nothing to say, but because it has learned that being seen matters more than being understood. This cost is paid in emotional fragmentation. When intimacy is performed rather than felt, the nervous system adapts by compartmentalizing. One version of the self is presented for consumption, while another is hidden away for protection. At first, this split feels empowering. It creates distance from vulnerability and shields against rejection. But maintaining this divide requires constant effort, and the longer it persists, the harder it becomes to integrate. Eventually, people struggle to know which parts of them are real and which were constructed to survive a particular environment. Authentic desire becomes difficult to recognize because it has been buried under layers of performance. Another overlooked cost is relational numbness. When attention is frequent but shallow, the emotional threshold rises. Ordinary connection starts to feel insufficient. Patience erodes. Depth feels slow. The nervous system becomes conditioned to intensity rather than intimacy. This makes long-term bonding difficult, not because the desire for connection disappears, but because the capacity to tolerate emotional stillness weakens. Silence feels uncomfortable. Stability feels boring. What once felt grounding now feels empty, not because it lacks meaning, but because the internal wiring has been reshaped by overstimulation. There is also a quiet grief that comes from being constantly chosen but rarely known. Being desired for what you represent rather than who you are creates a loneliness that is difficult to articulate. From the outside, life appears full, messages, offers, attention, but internally there is a persistent sense of invisibility. The person becomes hypervisible and unseen at the same time. This contradiction creates cognitive dissonance, where external validation clashes with internal emptiness. Over time, this dissonance can harden into cynicism or detachment as a form of self-protection. The long-term cost extends into self-trust. When life decisions are guided by short-term rewards, the internal compass weakens. People begin to doubt their instincts, not because they are incapable, but because they have been trained to outsource judgment to external response. Choice becomes reactive rather than intentional. The ability to sit with uncertainty diminishes, and without that capacity, growth stalls. What remains is a polished exterior sustained by momentum, while the inner world becomes increasingly disconnected from purpose, safety, and coherence. The demand cycle between men and women is not driven by biology alone, but by reinforcement. What is repeatedly rewarded becomes repeated behavior, and modern dynamics have created a feedback loop where desire is shaped more by incentives than intention. Men respond to what is made visible and accessible, while women adapt to what receives the most attention and resources. This interaction slowly turns attraction into a market and connection into a transaction. Neither side consciously designs this system, yet both participate in sustaining it, often while believing they are acting in their own best interest. Men, as consumers of desire, are conditioned to respond to immediacy. When access is easy and choice is abundant, selectiveness declines. The effort once required to pursue connection is replaced by convenience. This lowers emotional investment and shortens attention spans. Desire becomes reactive rather than deliberate. The more men engage with systems that reward minimal effort for maximum stimulation, the more their standards shift from compatibility to availability. Over time, this conditions attraction to respond to novelty instead of depth, creating a demand for constant variation rather than meaningful continuity. Women responding to this demand adjust presentation and behavior to remain competitive in an attention economy. Visibility becomes strategy, validation becomes data. When certain traits generate more engagement, those traits are amplified, often at the expense of individuality. This is not manipulation, it is adaptation. Humans adjust to environments that reward specific outcomes. However, when desirability is measured through response metrics, self-worth becomes tied to performance. The demand cycle encourages women to optimize for attraction rather than alignment, and in doing so, it narrows the range of acceptable expression. This cycle intensifies as each side reinforces the other's behavior. Increased supply of curated desirability raises expectations, which in turn increases demand for accessibility. Men become less willing to invest without immediate return, while women become less willing to withhold access without guarantee of reward. Suspicion replaces curiosity. Negotiation replaces discovery. Both sides grow guarded, interpreting vulnerability as risk rather than opportunity. The cycle feeds on itself, creating a dynamic where trust erodes even as desire remains high. What makes the demand cycle difficult to break is that it offers short-term satisfaction while undermining long-term connection. Both men and women benefit in limited ways. Men gain access, women gain attention. But neither gains stability, depth, or mutual understanding. The system rewards speed over sincerity and visibility over values. As a result, relationships become fragile, easily abandoned when effort is required, or novelty fades. The cycle persists not because it fulfills human needs, but because it continuously stimulates them, keeping both sides engaged without ever allowing resolution. Real worth is intrinsic, stable, and largely invisible, while market worth is performative, fluctuating, and highly responsive to demand. Real worth develops through character, competence, emotional regulation, and the ability to form healthy bonds. It exists whether or not anyone is watching. Market worth, by contrast, only exists in relation to an audience. It rises and falls with trends, attention, and relevance. The danger begins when people mistake market response for personal value, assuming that what is rewarded publicly must also be meaningful privately. This confusion leads individuals to invest heavily in what is visible while neglecting what is sustaining. Market worth is efficient but shallow. It reduces complex human beings into simplified traits that can be quickly evaluated and exchanged. Beauty, charisma, youth, and availability become currencies because they are easy to assess and easy to sell. But what is easy to sell is rarely what lasts. Real worth cannot be condensed into metrics or monetized without distortion. It reveals itself slowly through consistency under pressure and integrity when incentives disappear. While market worth demands constant upkeep, real worth strengthens through challenge, discipline, and self reflection. The psychological cost of prioritizing market worth is instability. When validation becomes the primary feedback loop, self perception becomes volatile. Confidence rises and falls with engagement, and identity becomes reactive rather than grounded. Real worth provides internal coherence. It allows a person to remain steady even when external circumstances shift. Without it, people become dependent on visibility to feel real, and silence feels like erasure. The pursuit of market worth trains individuals to optimize for appeal rather than truth, encouraging adaptation without alignment. What someone offers rather than who they are. This creates relationships built on exchange rather than mutual recognition. When circumstances change, the bond weakens. Real worth, however, creates resilience. It allows relationships to deepen because it is rooted in trust, reliability, and emotional presence. These qualities are not immediately impressive, but they become invaluable over time. The most overlooked difference between real worth and market worth is how they age. Market worth peaks and declines according to external standards that individuals cannot control. Real worth compounds. It grows richer with experience, self-knowledge, and refined judgment. Those who invest early in market worth often find themselves scrambling later to build what cannot be rushed. Those who cultivate real worth quietly gain leverage that does not expire because it is not dependent on demand, desirability, or visibility, but on the ability to live coherently, choose wisely, and remain intact when the market moves on. This entire conversation comes down to one uncomfortable truth. A culture that confuses visibility with value will eventually leave people empty, no matter how admired they once were. Attention, transactional desire, and market driven worth all promise power, freedom, and choice, but they quietly condition people to live reactively instead of intentionally. Men and women are not enemies in this system. They are participants shaped by incentives that reward immediacy over meaning and access over accountability. Real fulfillment does not come from being in demand, but from being anchored. It comes from cultivating real worth, character, discernment, boundaries, and emotional maturity. Qualities that do not trend but endure. Systems will continue to profit from desire, attention will continue to chase novelty, and markets will always reward what is easy to consume. But individuals still have a choice to build a life that works beyond applause, beyond youth, beyond validation. Because when the noise fades and the demand shifts, only what was real remains capable of holding you together